Now let's finish our level dynamics chapter by making the lift itself. Start by dragging the model into the scene and positioning it. In the Models folder, locate the model Prop Lift Exit and drag this into the scene. Position it at -21.85, 1.5, 48. We will also need to rotate it by 270 degrees in the y-axis. As always with dynamic objects in the scene, we wish to use light probes to light them. Expand the parent object of the lift and the inner doors, and then select Door Exit Inner Left and Right, the carriage, the mechanism and the wires. Then in the Mesh Renderer component, check the box for Use Light Probes. The next thing to address with the lift is to make sure that the player can collide with it and be carried to safety. As such, it will need a collider. However, since we are going to need a trigger collider on the parent game object, we will need to add the physical collider to a child game object. To keep this collider separate from the more complex meshes of the existing child game objects, we will make an empty game object and add a simple convex box mesh that we've prepared for this purpose. Go to Game Object, Create Empty, and then drag and drop this onto the parent object, Prop Lift Exit. Now that this is a child game object, it needs to be set at the same position as the parent, so reset its position to 0, 0, 0, as well as its rotation. And finally, rename it Prop Lift Collider. Now we can add a mesh collider to this game object and use the Circle Select button to search for the Prop Lift Exit Collision Mesh. Click Add Component, Physics, and Mesh Collider. Then under Mesh, click the selection button and search for prop_lift and choose Prop Lift Exit Collision. Close the window and you should see that this mesh is outlined in green and has 3 walls and a floor. This is all that we need collision-wise for the lift. Now reselect the parent game object Prop Lift Exit. We'll add a box trigger collider so that we know when the player has entered the lift. Click Add Component, Physics, Box Collider. Finally, ensure that the Is Trigger box is checked. We want the trigger to be just over the floor of the carriage, so set its center to 0, -1.1, 0, and the size to 3.3, 0.5, 3.5. Since the colliders will be moving, we need a rigid body component, and since we don't want it to react to collisions, we will make it kinematic. Click Add Component, Physics, Rigid Body, uncheck Use Gravity, and check Is Kinematic. The lift should make a whirring noise as it moves, and as such it will require an audio source component. Add this now. We don't want this to play on a wake, but we do want the clip to loop. Also, since this audio source is only going to play one clip, we can apply it directly to the source. In the Audio folder, the clip is called lift_raise. Drag and drop this onto the audio clip property. Next, apply the lift door tracking script that we made in the last assignment. Remember that you can collapse your components by clicking on their names. We can then go into the Scripts folder and Level Dynamics and drag and drop Lift Doors Tracking onto the inspector for this object. The last thing we need for the lift is a script to trigger its movement. Choose Add Component, New Script, and we'll name our new script Lift Trigger. Double-click its icon to launch for editing, and prepare it as usual. For this script, we are going to need a few public variables that we can tweak. The first one we want is a float to control how long before the doors close after the player enters the lift. We don't want the lift to start the instant the doors close, so we need an amount of time before the lift starts. Also, we don't want the level to end as soon as the lift starts moving, so we need a variable for that too. It would also be nice to be able to tweak the speed that the lift moves at, so we will have that as a public float as well. Next, we need some private variables, including some references. First, we need a reference to the player, and also a reference to the player's animator component, so that we can stop the player from moving when the lift starts to move. Since we will be referencing an animator, we want to use our #ID script. When the lift moves, we would like it to disappear at the top of the screen, instead of being tracked by the camera all the way up. So we will need a reference to the camera movement script so that we can disable it when the lift moves. To end the level with our fade to black, we need a reference to our scene fade in out script. So that we can control when the lift doors are opening and closing, we need a reference to the lift doors tracking script. We don't need any more references, but we do need a Boolean variable to store whether the player is in the lift or not. And finally, a timer that will set the doors closing, when the lift can start moving, and when the level should end. Now we can set up our references in the awake function. The next two functions we will use in this script are onTriggerEnter and onTriggerExit to handle detection of the player entering and exiting the lift's internal trigger zone. Firstly, we will use onTriggerEnter. If it is the player that is the triggering game object, then we can set the playerInLift variable to true. Next, we set this variable back to false when the player leaves the trigger zone by using onTriggerExit. If the player leaves the lift, we will need to reset the timer that controls its actions, so that when the player returns to the lift, the process can start over again. Next, we're going to add an update function. We're going to use update for a couple of things. Primarily, we will use it to check whether the player is in the lift, and if they are, we will call a function to activate the lift. We will create this function first, and then come back and add the call to it later. We will call the function liftActivation. The first thing we need to do when the function is called is to start the timer counting upward. Then we only need to worry about doing anything if the timer exceeds the time to lift start variable. If the lift has started, then we want to stop the player from moving, and we can do this by setting the speed parameter of their animator to 0. We also want the camera to stop tracking the player, so we will disable the camera movement script. In order that the player moves upward with the lift, we're going to parent the player to the lift. This means that his position will be local to that of the lift. To move the lift, we're simply going to use the translate function. We are moving the lift in an upwards direction, multiplied by an amount of lift speed per second. This function is going to be called every frame once the player is in the lift, and this part of the function will be called every frame once the lift starts moving. To play the audio of the lift, we only need to start the audio source playing, so we will add a call to the play function, but only call this if it is not already playing, so that each frame after this, we are not trying to play it unnecessarily. The last part of this function will end the level when an appropriate amount of time has elapsed. To actually end the level, we will call the endScene function from the scene fade in-out script, which fades to black and reloads the scene. Now that the lift activation function is finished, we can put a call to it in the update function. We only want to do so, however, when the player is in the lift. The last thing to do in this script is to control when the inner lift doors open and close. We will do this in the update function as well. If the timer is less than the time before the doors should close, then the inner doors should be tracking the outer doors. We can make this happen by calling the door following function from the lift doors tracking script that we wrote previously. However, if the timer has exceeded the time to close variable, then we want the doors to close. That completes the lift. Save your script now and return to the editor. We will also store the lift as a prefab. Drag and drop it into the prefabs folder in the project panel to do this. Now we want to save the scene and the project. Now we have a scene with working level dynamics. We can explore the level with the doors opening and closing and pick up the key so that we can escape in the lift. One final thing to do is to tidy up our script. Select the Assets folder in the project panel and then drag the lift trigger script into the Scripts Level Dynamics folder. In the next and final chapter, we will create the robot guards that patrol the level.